Thank you, Mr Speaker. Well, I rise to support the Holidays Amendment Bill. This bill is indeed going to improve the overall operation and efficiency of the Holidays Act 2003. The people of Rangitata have told me they support this bill, therefore I commend it to the House.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I think it's absolutely unbelievable that on an issue as important as this, national members are taking 5 second speeches and not bothering to address any of the issues that are being raised by members on this side of the House. It shows the level of contempt that they have for the people who are going to be worst affected by this bill, which are the wage and salary earners in New Zealand, particularly those at the lower end of the income scale. And I want to endorse the comments made by the Labour, Green and Māori Party members on this particular piece of legislation. And I think it shows just how out of touch National is with the reality for working people, that they think that they have some kind of choice as to whether or not they cash up this week's holiday. Roger Douglas in his contribution, unbelievable. This is not about choice. When the decision is between being able to pay the bills and having that extra week's leave, that is not choice. And I suspect that members in this House get out of their ivory towers and go and talk to some of the families that are really struggling. Go and tell them the stories about sandcastles on the beach. Well, David Bennett's sitting over there signing his Christmas cards. I'm sure he'll get a nice break with his family over the holidays. Isn't it ironic that he is taking away a lot of the protections that exist under law currently to ensure that all working people in New Zealand can enjoy time with their families, and particularly on days of importance such as Christmas Day? Because this is not about choice for those families. They have no choice. You take Roger Douglas's argument to its logical conclusion, poor people are just choosing not to live in mansions. They're choosing not to be able to afford food. If they're being kicked out of their house because they can't pay their rent, they just chose not to pay their rent. That's right, because we're passing this legislation which is going to put workers in an unenviable position, which is having to trade off time with their family, time to regenerate and rejuvenate, time to ensure that they're more productive when they go back to work, because they cannot afford to pay the bills. And national members have kind of talked as though it's a really positive thing that workers are going to be cashing up leave, as though they're really proud of their record in government so far, which has seen unemployment soar for those, but also for those who are in work, has seen cost of living go up and up and up. They increased GST to 15% earlier this year, despite promising during the election campaign that they would not increase GST. Well, that has hit the low-income families the hardest, and these are the very families who are going to find themselves in a position, because they haven't had a pay increase, of having to cash up a week's leave which would have been time with their kids, with their family, in order to pay the bills. It's also important to point out that a lot of these workers who will be put in this position will be shift workers. These are people who work hours where they don't get to see their families. It's not a 9-to-5 job where they go home at the end of the night and still get some time with their kids, time with their husband or their wife. A lot of these are people who work more than one job. A lot of these are people who work at night. They're the people who come into our offices at midnight to clean them. People who come in at midnight to clean our offices, the people who leave as their kids are getting home from school. That makes annual leave even more precious. When you work a job which means that you don't get to see your family very often, it means that those 4 weeks become even more precious. So when you're put in a position because you're not getting a pay increase and you can't pay the bills, having to give up that week's leave, a week with your kids, with your family, is even harder to bear, and even harder for those families. And this is from a national-led government which says that they're family-friendly. Family-friendly. Well, everything they have done to undermine the conditions of workers in New Zealand goes against the rhetoric that says that they are family-friendly, because this is possibly one of the least family-friendly pieces of legislation that we've seen in Parliament so far. Because the interesting thing is that National and Act members only see annual leave in terms of its dollar cost. They don't see any other value to it other than what it costs in dollars. They don't see the benefits for the families. They don't see the increased productivity in the workplace because workers are actually rested, because they actually feel like they've had some proper time with their families. As my colleague Darian Fenton said, they just see it as a commodity. It's just a commodity. One more thing in this world that can be bought and sold and traded with no intrinsic value at all. And that approach, Mr. Speaker, is absolutely wrong. And now I want to talk about the argument that annual leave is a property right. And this feeds into this thing that's just something to be bought and sold, because we've heard throughout the course of this debate from National and ACT members that, annual leave or holidays are a property right. Well, I want to know where that respect for property rights was when this government passed legislation earlier this year taking annual leave off people who are entitled to ACC. Because what they said is if you have two workers who have the same accident and end up unable to work in the same position and they both get the same entitlement to ACC, but one of those workers has no annual leave owing because they've already taken it all, and the other worker has 4 weeks owing because they've been saving it up for time at home over Christmas or whatever, that the worker who's already taken all their leave when they have their accident gets ACC. But the worker who doesn't, who does have annual leave owing, 4 weeks that they've been saving up, that they have to use that up first before they get the ACC entitlement. So where was the respect for property rights? Where was the respect for property rights when the national government took away those holidays? Because they'll just say whatever suits them at the time. And the inconsistency between the arguments coming from the government need to be pointed out. It is scurrilous. I agree with you, Mr. Woodhouse. It's absolutely scurrilous. Absolutely scurrilous.
Order.
Well, I know this is a touchy subject for David Bennett. David Bennett was the chair of the Select Committee, who again took a 5-second call on this piece of legislation. David Bennett, who stopped a lot of submitters actually appearing at Select Committee, who restricted the time opposition members had to question. I think that it was a shame that he didn't feel that it was necessary to take more than a 5-second call given his position as chair of the Select Committee and the extra $10,000 a year that he gets in order to be chair of a Select Committee. That's hardly good value for money that I would suggest, Mr. Speaker. And I want to talk about the issue around the sick leave changes, because currently under the law, if an employer has reason to believe that someone is rorting sick leave, they can require a medical certificate. And that is absolutely just and fair. Absolutely fair. For example, if someone keeps taking Fridays or Mondays off, or if someone does, it can cost $69 in Gisborne if you have to go to the doctor on a weekend. And so if someone is obviously, taking lots of Fridays and Mondays off, or the boss sees them on TV at the rugby, absolutely they can require a medical certificate. But what this change does is says that if you're sick for 1 day, your employer can require a medical certificate. I mean, that is completely impractical. All the evidence we had at Select Committee is this can't work. I mean, it would be impossible for all these workers to be able to get access to a GP anyway. And what if you've got just a cold or a flu, something which any doctor will tell you, don't bother coming in, just get lots of rest and fluids and blah, blah, blah. Well, they will now have to go to a doctor if the employer tells them that they want a medical certificate. It's total ideology over practicality in the extreme. And the ridiculous thing is an employer now can already require a medical certificate. The only thing this bill is changing is they no longer have to have any reason to actually suspect that someone is rorting it. And members obviously keep saying, well, that's not going to happen. But what, of course, happens is it completely changes the situation for that employee who's sick. Because regardless of whether or not the employer actually does go on to require a medical certificate, they know when they get sick that they can. They know that when they get sick, my employer can require a medical certificate, so I'm just going to go into work. And what we know, and what the Select Committee was told, and what officials told the government, and they chose to ignore it, is that, one, New Zealanders take, on average, far less sick leave than the rest of the world, rest of the OECD countries that we compare ourselves to. And number two, the biggest cost to businesses when it comes to sick leave is not the cost of employees taking sick leave, but the cost of them turning up to work and making everyone else sick, and the lost productivity that comes from that. The evidence is absolutely irrefutable. That is. It came from Treasury, which are hardly the most liberal left-wing government department that there is. Well, Mr Power thinks that's under question. But Treasury don't take these things lightly. They tend to be very conservative about these matters, and they've said the biggest issues is that employees